Hello and good late afternoon. My name is Annika Lenson, an associate professor of history of art here at UC Berkeley and a member of the executive steering committee for the Center for Middle East Studies. It gives me immense pleasure to welcome Professor Chanchal Dadlani to our center. And yes, we are here in person, gathered, and to our community to speak to us tonight on the topic Global Kitabkhana, Mughal art, French Orientalism, and knowledge production in the 18th century. Professor Dadlani is a professor of architectural history, Islamic art and architecture, and South Asian art and architecture in the Department of Art at Wake Forest University, where she's also associate chair and ZSR Foundation faculty fellow. Her first book, From Stone to Paper, Architecture as History in the Late Mughal Empire, published by Yale University Press in 2018, received a Mellon Author Award from the Society of Architectural Historians and was shortlisted for the Charles Rufus Maury Book Award from the College Art Association, as well as the Kenscher Prize, Center for 18th Century Studies. Her research has been supported by the National Endowment for the Humanities, the Getty Research Institute, Fulbright Hays, and the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation. You can find articles by Chanchal in Ars Orientalis, Art Forum, and Art History on topics including Mughal art, exchanges between France and India, and the global reception of contemporary South Asian art. We are just delighted that Professor Dadlani was able to join us this evening. In terms of the format of the talk, Professor Dadlani will hold the floor for the usual 40 to 45 minutes, after which time we'll be able to take questions from the audience. The way we propose to do that is by inviting people joining us by Zoom to enter questions in the chat. I will moderate. And then at about 5:05 p.m., we will conclude the public broadcast portion of the talk, after which time Professor Dadlani will continue taking questions from those of us who are able to gather with her here on campus. So without further ado, I turn it over to Professor Dadlani.
Thank you so much, Annika, for that welcome, as well as the invitation. I'm really thrilled to be here today. It's a real pleasure to be in Berkeley. I see old friends and new friends in the audience, the virtual audience and the real audience, and it's a real thrill to be able to share this work. I'd like to sincerely thank the Center for Middle East Studies for the invitation, in particular the conveners of the CMES Visual Arts Working Group, and that's Annika Lenson, Persis Berlekamp, and Asma Kazmi. We've had some great conversations, and I look forward to more. So I will go ahead and turn to this. I trust everyone can see the screen and can hear me, and I can see a few of you. So if you can't, please wave frantically so that we can change things. Okay, great. In 1778, the French army officer and political operative Jean-Baptiste Jaunty appeared at the court of Louis XVI at Versailles. Jaunty was recently returned from India, where he had served the French East India Company for 26 years. During his reception, Jaunty presented the court with a sizable collection of paintings, albums, and manuscripts, all amassed during his tenure on the subcontinent. Among these was the Gentil Album. My study of the Gentil Album is part of a larger project on the circulation of images, ideas, and individuals between India and France in the 18th century. Although art history has emphasized the British presence in South Asia, largely because of colonial legacies with which we're all familiar, less is known about the French role in the story of Indian and European encounter. In the broader project, I focus on three interconnected areas: the scope of Jaunty's collection of manuscripts and albums, the nature of his collaborations with Indian artists and scholars, and his varied connections to other patrons, collectors, and scholars of Indian art and texts, both in India and in France. In other words, I emphasize intersections between multiple systems of artistic and epistemic production, from the manuscript workshops and markets of 18th century North India to the networks of early French Orientalism. Before I delve into these themes and map out the particular arguments I'll advance today, I'd like to first orient you to the historical moment in which the Gentil Album was produced and some of the specific details about the album itself. And this history will be familiar to some, but I think it's still important to go over it. The Mughal Empire was founded in the 16th century and expanded considerably through the 17th. At its height, it encompassed much of South Asia, developed a sophisticated centralized state structure, and enjoyed a premier position in global trade and diplomatic networks. But my talk today is set during a less celebrated moment, the late 18th century. By this point, the Mughal Empire had become fragmented. Political, economic, and military power had been seized by regional Indian rulers and European trading companies, particularly the English and French East India companies. Mughal governors transformed their provinces into semi-autonomous states, some decisively rebelling, and some forging alliances with French and English forces. This was the context in which the Jaunty album was produced, a moment when Mughal legacies were being fiercely contested, and the idea of Mughal history and culture was being shaped for global consumption. As for Jaunty, he first arrived in India in 1752. After a decade of military service in the Deccan, he ultimately settled in Faizabad in the northeastern province of Awadh, where he was the French resident at the court of Shuja ad-Dawla. Shuja was not only the governor or Nawab of Awadh, but also the prime vizier of the Mughal Empire. Therefore, Jaunty's residence at the court was considered a great strategic asset. In Faizabad, Jaunty wove himself into the social fabric of the city. He married an Indo-Portuguese woman named Teresa Velho, whose family had long-standing ties to the Mughal court. And when Jaunty returned to France, he did so with his wife, their children, and several of his in-laws. In other words, with a multi-generational and multicultural family. While in Faizabad, Jaunty also collected and commissioned art. The collection that he built was extensive and impressive in scope. Today, the Bibliothèque Nationale alone holds over 140 objects from the Jaunty collection in its European and Oriental manuscript sections, and about 40 to 50 objects form the original core of the Indian painting section. The manuscripts that he collected included works in Arabic, Persian, and Sanskrit, and covered a range of topics from history and religion to law and lexicography to painting and calligraphy. So we see a wide range of subject matters and of languages. But part of what made the Jaunty collection remarkable was the collaborations that produced it. In addition to extant manuscripts, the other part of the Jaunty collection included newly created works featuring text translated with the help of Indian munshis or scholar scribes and images produced by a studio of artists who worked for Jaunty. These works too are diverse in nature. We have, for example, an atlas of the Mughal Empire with maps of Mughal provinces framed by historical or mythological vignettes, and that's what I'm showing you up top here. There's also a set of architectural studies of Indian buildings known as the Palais Indien. And then there's a set of histories illustrated from Persian into French and translated from Persian into French and illustrated to varying degrees. Although the Gentil album is going to be my focus today, I would like us to bear in mind the larger material context of this object, a collection that on the one hand included extant manuscripts of medieval and early modern Indian historical works like the Tarikh-i-Farishta or the Aini-Akbari, which we'll talk about more shortly, works that were or would become canonical, and on the other hand, newly produced objects with rich, extensive visual programs. Traditionally, the Gentil album, we're looking here at 4 folios that I'll get into shortly, has been considered a customs and manners album, a recording of people, objects, and rituals that Jaunty himself observed. In this instance, the customs and manners genre does actually not allow us to fully comprehend this object, and in particular, the connections between the album and Mughal manuscript culture. Now, when I use the expression Mughal manuscript culture, I am referring to the artists, writers, translators, and patrons who were the collective objects, makers of objects. And I'm also referring to the practices of copying and collecting that were intrinsic to the making and circulation of artworks in Mughal India, whether drawings, paintings, calligraphies, manuscripts, or albums. This culture of books was centered primarily around the Kitabkhana, the Persian word that literally means book house, but also translates as workshop or library. The Kitabkhana was an essential institution of early modern court culture in Mughal India and beyond, and we'll spend some time thinking about it today. By analyzing the Gentil album as a product of its local environment of generation and emphasizing the deep roots and practices of the Kitabkhana, we can revise histories of early modern cross-cultural encounter that have emphasized the primacy of European patrons. And instead, we can stress the role played by Mughal visual traditions and artists in shaping objects that would travel around the world. In my talk today, I will interpret the album in relation to established Indian painting practices and consider the agency of individual artists in its production. I will then argue that the album is not solely the product of eyewitness observation, but is profoundly influenced by a major historical work, the Aini Akbari, or Institutes of Akbar, written in the 1590s by the Mughal court historian and minister Abu Fazl. Finally, I will connect the album to Jaunty's self-representation as an authority on India and consider its reception in France. My examination of this object will reveal the license that Jaunty took as a translator and historian, his fluid relationship to source text, and the prominent role that images played in this process of translation. It is the flexible relationship between text and translation that creates a space for images and the artists who made them to play a remarkably noticeable role in the dissemination of historical knowledge in this case. As we will see, the object decisively blurs the lines between seemingly fixed categories such as French and Indian, European and Islamic, artist and translator, patron and maker. Given these themes, cross-cultural collaboration, visual translation, and imperial collecting, the story of the Jaunty album allows us to ask fundamental questions about what constitutes a globalized art in the late 18th century. Now to turn to the album itself. Dating to 1774, it features 58 paintings rendered in opaque watercolor and wash-on paper. It measures 37 by 53.5 centimeters or 14.5 by 21 inches and is thus of a substantial size. The subject matter ranges considerably, but broadly speaking, it includes paintings depicting the Mughal court and imperial ceremonies, royal hunts, contemporary political events, miscellaneous sports and entertainments, and the ritual practices and belief systems of Islam and Hinduism. About 2/3 of the paintings are paired with French text, with all images on recto and text on the facing verso. At times, the images are accompanied by extensive commentary, while in other instances, the images stand alone or are only briefly annotated. At least 3 individuals, all based in Faizabad, collaborated to produce the album. Jaunty, who we've discussed, and the artists Mohan Singh and Nevasi Lal. Jaunty was not only the patron of the album, but was also closely involved in its production. Unfinished paintings suggest that Jaunty divided the folios into sections and noted which subjects should be painted. He also penned the French labels and much of the explanatory text that accompanies several of the paintings. Although individual folios are unsigned, the painters Mohan Singh and Nevasi Lal are mentioned in a short preface to the album. The 2 were active at the royal court of Shuja Abdullah and in the studio of painters, the Kitabkhana, that Jaunty supported during his tenure in Faizabad. We'll discuss them in greater length shortly, along with the question of how we might restore agency to artists who are somewhat hidden in a certain kind of archival record. At first glance, the folios might seem to mark a clear departure from the received conventions of Mughal painting. On the left, we see a court assembly or darbar from the Gentil Album, and on the right, a court scene from a Mughal manuscript, the famous Badshahnama, a resplendent 16th century manuscript that set the standard for Mughal court scenes for the centuries to come, and that, not insignificantly, was housed in Awadh in the 18th century. If we look at this comparison, we see that the neatly composed Jaunty album image appears to dismantle the older Mughal scene. In both examples, the Mughal emperor is enthroned and shown with a halo, which is an established iconography to signal imperial status. While both paintings are conceived around this central figure of the emperor, their compositional differences are readily apparent. In the Mughal painting, nobles, attendants, and ceremonial objects all occupy the same representational space. In the Jaunty image, by contrast, these elements are separated and carefully placed in rows and columns. The scene is thus broken apart and reorganized, with a premium placed on regularity, legibility, and systematic comprehension. Before we kind of emphasize this difference, though, I'd like to actually think about the Badshahnama in a longer tradition of Mughal painting. So let me emphasize that it actually signified a significant shift in compositional strategies in Mughal painting. Earlier Mughal paintings were characterized by a visual energy and drama, and we see a great example here on the left from the Akbarnama, or Book of Akbar, which was the history of the reign of the Mughal Emperor Akbar. Here we are looking at Akbar tames the mad elephant Havai. In this fantastic episode that recounts an elephant fight, Akbar sits atop a maddened elephant outside the walls of the royal fort in Agra. You can see those red walls in the background, not far from where the Taj Mahal would later be built. This elephant is pitted against another, and eventually the two charge towards the Yamuna River and over a bridge of boats. As the ultimate hero king, Akbar manages to restrain the elephant and will live to rule another day. The formal drama really reflects this narrative drama. We see strong diagonals that take the elephants and Akbar across the bridge of boats. The water is turbulent, figures fly, and boats buckle as the bridge collapses. The energy of this composition on the left makes the Badshahnama on the right almost staid by comparison. Whereas earlier Mughal historical manuscripts were characterized by a visual dynamism, in the Badshahnama paintings, a particular formula emerges. We see figures neatly compartmentalized into distinct horizontal and vertical zones. We see the emperor and the royal family in the uppermost level. Below them are nobility of high rank, and below them in the third band are those who fall outside of the rank holder system. There are also three vertical zones where you see the emperor placed front and center. The figures are depicted statically, and important individuals are actually identified with small annotations, which I think you probably can't see on your screen, but they're there. This compositional scheme is replicated again and again in the Badshahnama. Throughout, we see this steadfast insistence on compartmentalization and a consistent practice of annotating or labeling figures. So this should actually make us think about the Gentil album. But it was not just manuscripts like the Badshahnama that the artists in Awadh were looking at. They also had access to albums or murakas. Here we see a portrait of Khan Doran, a Mughal general, painted against a monochromatic background, that is, isolated from any recognizable court setting. The depiction of Khan Doran is itself surrounded by a sizable border featuring smaller likenesses of court officials. Although these figures are rendered in a naturalistic style, characteristic of late 17th century Mughal painting, the placement of the individual depictions across the border of the folio offers a striking comparison with the Jaunty image of the Mughal court. This is an example of a single figure portrait from Muraka. And in other instances, maraccas gathered composite images, often drawn from the collections of Indian, Iranian, and European objects in the imperial treasury. These are two examples from the famous Gulshan album. The image on the left pastes together 4 separate Mughal portraits and then paints over the seams between them, while the folio on the right combines a German engraving, 2 Persian drawings, and a painting of a lion, and really exposes those seams. Read in relation to this tradition, the Jaunty folio could just as easily be an amalgamation of single figure paintings as much as a dismantled court scene. The comparisons between the Jaunty painting and other examples from Mughal art are also important when we think about medium and materiality, which is a major theme of our working group. Throughout, we see figures rendered in watercolor and wash, and they have a lightness and a transparency that contrasts with the saturated images I've shown you so far. In the scholarship on the late 18th century, the use of watercolor is often ascribed to the influence or desires of European patrons, a hallmark of a genre known as company painting, which again, some of you will be familiar with and which takes its name from the trading companies, the European trading companies. However, neem kalam drawings may have also played a role here. Literally translated as half pen, the neem kalam technique involves subtly graded monochromatic lines enhanced by pale washes of color, as we see in this Mughal portrait. And to emphasize once again the richness of the collections in Avad, the richness of the collections that these artists were working with, this drawing also once belonged to Shuja Badullah. Now we've taken this kind of deep dive and looked at these comparisons, but I want to sort of zoom out, not quite there yet, and just explain that my reason for raising these comparisons is actually not to determine precise sources for the Gentil album. So I'm not trying to play a matching game here, but quite the opposite. I'd like to show the array of paintings available to the artists of the album and to reveal what I think of as the Mughal artist's maracca mentality. These visual echoes are significant when we think about the nature of artistic practice in the realms of West, Central, and South Asia, where painters constantly looked to the visual past as the foundation of artistic knowledge. In this system, the maracca functioned as a storehouse of such knowledge, a repository for past examples and current experiments, and was accessible and reinforced through that larger storehouse and repository, the Kitabkhana. The artists working for Jaunty grew out of this tradition, one which had roots stretching as far back as the Timurid ateliers of 15th century Iran and Central Asia, and that also had contemporary currency across the Islamic and Indian worlds, from Ottoman Turkey to Safavid Iran to the Rajput princely courts of North India. The mobility of artists and objects between Delhi and Avad was a major hallmark of this particular historical moment, and it would have easily facilitated a historically rooted painting practice. Artists in Avad had access to a rich inventory of paintings, especially as the Imperial Library from Delhi had by now been dispersed, and many of its finest objects had been transported to regional capitals like Faizabad. Moreover, artists in the region were often trained in the techniques of Mughal painting and had familial and pedagogical ties tracing back to the imperial ateliers in Delhi. Mohan Singh's father, for example, had been an imperial painter. Thus, despite the absence of signatures on individual folios or extensive artist biographies, we can still trace the formation of artists working with Jaunty and consider their agency. These artists eventually produced a coherent visual language that we see across the album, and in fact, as we'll see, across the collection at large, one that effectively operates as a Jaunty house style. To produce this style, the painters drew upon conventions of a historically anchored practice, fashioning it into a new visual vocabulary that had the potential to facilitate legibility for a new cultural audience. Yet for an audience accustomed to Mughal visuality, the album mediates between old and new. This kind of, I think of this as a visual multilingualism, and this kind of visual multilingualism was hardly new to the Mughal artist, or perhaps the Indian artist more broadly, but we can talk about that later. For instance, as Govan Bailey, Abba Kach, and others have shown, when European prints and books had arrived at the Mughal court with the Jesuit missions in as early as the late 1500s, the artists of the imperial workshops set about including Christian imagery and European pictorial devices, such as modeling and naturalism in their repertoire. Yael Rice has further argued that Mughal artists were perfectly positioned to absorb the pictorial style and technologies of print, since they had long been exposed to and practiced a tradition of line-based art with calligraphy. And even the most elementary of Mughal painting studies claims, or introductory of Mughal painting studies, claims of visual syncretism, that is, the ability to coalesce multiple painting styles as one of its defining features. And there's plenty to talk about with this painting. I could give a talk just on it, but a few things I'll highlight are, of course, the angels rushing down from the heavens, the naturalism of these figures. They're really finely rendered. And these elements, the angels in particular, are drawn from European prints and Christian imagery, but are absorbed into a complex visual system that is part of a Mughal symbolic code that represents Shah Jahan as king of the world, standing atop a globe, ruling with divine sanction. So if we're thinking now about the multilingual, we are confronted with yet another layer of complexity with the Jaunty album, and that is the hand of Jaunty himself. As I mentioned before, he includes textual labels in French. These ostensibly elucidate the image or parse their content. In reading the labels in this folio, for example, we discovered that the upper level of the painting depicts high-ranking nobles, such as the prime vizier and military commanders. And in the next two registers, according to the labels, there are palace officials and keepers ranging from the librarian to the head gardener. And finally, in the lowest register, we see important ceremonial objects. So from left to right, we see standards of imperial honor given by the emperor to select nobles, examples of a fixed throne, an imperial tent in the center there, and then a portable throne that you would see atop an elephant, for instance, and the chhatri or parasol, which signified the imperial presence and instruments from the ceremonial band. Now, we might look at this collection of images and we might understand this impulse to collect and catalog and describe as a product of European Enlightenment practices and preoccupation with the encyclopedic. We might see a similar impulse in the composition of the folio. And recall for a long time that this album was in fact classified as a European customs and manners album. But one of the major discoveries of my work has been that the album is actually informed by the structure and content of a key Mughal source, the Aini-Akbari, or Institutes of Akbar, written by Abu Fazl during the 1590s. When the Mughal Empire was expanding, Akbar's prime vizier, Abu Fazl, compiled a multi-volume encyclopedic text with statistical and narrative descriptions of India, covering topics from geography to the central tenets of Hinduism. Abu Fazl then built upon the information he had collected and detailed the administrative apparatus of the Mughal Empire and celebrated Akbar's successful leadership. In other words, he included descriptions of what the Mughals encountered and of the young Mughal state itself. Now, for a student of the Mughal Empire like myself, this is a central text, one that we study closely, but it's not a text that a historian of European art would typically know. This meant that when I encountered the fascinating paintings in the Gentil album, I was somewhat unusually positioned to realize that I was actually beholding what I have called a visual translation of the Aini-Akbari. what I propose is that, well, before I get to that, let me briefly describe the Aini Akbari for those who aren't familiar with it. It's a 5-volume work that covers a dizzying array of topics. The first volume focuses on the imperial palace, but it's really miscellaneous. So in describing the kitchens, for example, the text will include a series of recipes. The following 4 volumes continue in a similar vein. Volume 2 moves beyond the palace to address everything from the military and taxation to hunting and pigeon flying. Volume 3 widens the lens to include descriptions of the provinces of the empire. Volume 4 explicates Hindu belief systems and religious practices. And finally, Volume 5 includes sayings of the emperor. What I'm proposing here is that Jaunty drew upon different parts of this narrative, informing his picture of the Mughal court that we're looking at here. The posts and objects mentioned here are described in detail in the Aini Akbari. However, the information is not included in any one chapter. Rather, information from multiple chapters appears to have been synthesized and used as the basis of the image, and then the image is accompanied by a key. So we see here a visualization of information that has already been processed. This method of translation relies extensively on the visual and produces a quite different effect than what we would see if Jaunty provided extensive chapter translations in text and augmented these with images. In this way, the album functions as a visual translation versus an illustrated textual translation. And here I'm using the word translation for its dynamism and flexibility. A translation, of course, is always generative, resulting in something new rather than retaining a static relationship to its source. As we look at other folios from the album, the idea of translation persistently comes to the fore. At times, there is a close correspondence between a single textual passage and a single folio. Here, for instance, we see the creation of the 4 major Hindu castes. As the facing text mentions, the Aini Akbari reports that the Brahmin caste was produced from the mouth of the Hindu god Brahma, the Kshatriya from his arms, the Vaishya from his thigh, and the Shudra from his feet. This is what the artist of the folio renders. In his hands, Brahma holds the laws to be passed down to each of these groups, and we learn more about their individual responsibilities. So on the lower left, we see the Brahmins who carry out religious instructions, and then the Shudras who are painting, sculpting, and making objects in silver and gold. Again, the image fully visualizes the text of the Aini Akbari. So certainly an audience new to this information would turn to the key, but the pattern of transmission here is from historical text to painted image to key rather than from text to text. And this point is even more important when we think about other images from the Jaunty album, which are not accompanied by text at all. So for example, this folio depicts various types of jewels, one of the most frequently published from this art object, in fact. It actually reflects a chapter from Nain, which contains a brief description of types of jewelry, such as an earring in the shape of a peacock, which I don't know if my cursor is showing up, but you can see on the upper left there. The resonances with the Aini Akbari continue throughout the album. A folio depicts methods for hunting tigers and elephants using nets and fences and various kinds of traps. The strategies are the same ones detailed in the Aini Akbari. And then we have an image of equestrian sports from the Aini Akbari and a representation of acrobatics, once again from the text, and miscellaneous games and entertainments, a visual catalog, which matches descriptions from the text. And one of these is actually Chopar, which in the Mughal context, we know from this giant board at Fatehpur Sikri. Furthermore, the broader Jaunty collection demonstrates clear connections with the Aini Akbari. The Atlas of the Mughal Empire that Jaunty commissioned was based on the section of the Ain that described the provinces of India. And individual provinces, as I mentioned, are rendered cartographically with these vignettes surrounding them. This all comes from the Aini Akbari. The atlas in the album also demonstrates stylistic as well as conceptual links. In more than one instance, specific images are shared by the works, as in this detail of a lion hunt. In both objects, a lion is surrounded by hunters on elephants, and the central lion and elephant, with the lion lunging upward as the elephant twists its head around, appears almost identical. Although the artist associated with each of these objects is different, they were clearly in dialogue in the setting of the Kitabkhana. And again, these continuities reveal the coherence of the collection as a totality. And here I'm thinking about what I referred to as the Jaunty house style earlier, and also suggest the extent to which the Aini Akbari permeated Jaunty's collection as a whole. Thus, rather than functioning as an observed catalog of types, these images of figures of the Mughal court, the members of the Hindu castes, and something as seemingly everyday as Indian jewelry actually visualize and animate one of the foundational texts of Mughal history. Now, interestingly, this is not to say that the Gentil Album adheres to the text. Instead, it uses the Aini Akbari as a scaffold, absorbing select topics and passages and introducing new subjects that resonate with the content and scope of the original source text. So for example, down below here, we're looking at the famed peacock throne of Shah Jahan, which of course was not in the original Aini Akbari, since Shah Jahan ruled later, and a folio showing Muslim prayer and the orientation of the body towards Mecca. In other words, there is this clearly discernible ethnographic impulse in the Gentil Album, but this impulse can be traced as far back as the late 16th century and the imperial expansion of the early Mughals under Akbar. It is not surprising that 2 centuries later, the Aini Akbari drew the interest of European scholars, translators, collectors, and administrators affiliated with the French and English East India companies. But the historical roots of the ethnographic are, I think, quite crucial. Soon after the Jaunty album was produced, Francis Gladwin published a partial translation of the text under the auspices of the English East India Company, and it would be translated again in the 19th century. But what is unusual about the Jaunty album is the mode of interpretation and expression adopted by the translation. Whereas other early translations of the text are unillustrated, the Gentil Album deploys images to such an extent that it virtually buries the text on which many of its images are based. As a result, the album opens itself up to a more general audience and a measure of instability. Jaunty, Nivasi Lal, and Mohan Singh may have based their paintings on passages from the Aini Akbari, but the images could be, and ultimately were, read differently by different audiences. For the resulting object was multilingual and multivalent, expressed in the languages of text and image, engaging established and emerging modes of visuality, containing French captions based on a Mughal source, written in Persian, and legible as both a translation of a specific Mughal text and a general text on Indian history and customs. The album's potential to speak to multiple audiences was matched by another characteristic of the Gentil album, that is its ability to move fluidly between genres. It was at once ethnography, history, and autobiography. Just as Abu Fazl had written about Akbar, so too does Jaunty celebrate moments from the life of Shuja Abdullah. In other words, the Aini Akbari may have served as a template not only for the quote ethnographic moments in the Jaunty album, but also the historical content that relates to the 18th century. And here it's worth just reminding ourselves that the Aini Akbari is part of a larger work, the Akbarnama, or the Book of Akbar. As I'll show now, we actually can see shades of this broader history writing endeavor in the Jaunty album. Often, the album combines ostensibly ethnographic images with specific portrayals of the Nawab Shuja-ud-Dawla. We see that in this procession taking place during the holy month of Muharram. The event is mourned through a ritual of collective mourning sacred to Shi'i Muslims, illustrated here. Figures are neatly lined up, creating a regular rhythm along the page and allowing people and objects to be clearly displayed. As with the earlier depictions, numerical labels correspond to an explanatory text. Oh, pardon. On one level, this might be read as an ethnographic depiction, documenting a local socio-religious practice. And there's a premium placed on the display of figures and objects. For instance, the tazieh, which we see in the lower right-hand corner, or the models of shrines and tombs, are really prominent here. But at the same time, a single textual gloss reads Nabab, which we can see on the upper right, and singles out the Nawab Shuja-ud-Dawla. In this example too, we might read these first as generic hunting scenes, but a closer look reveals that they actually celebrate Shuja-ud-Dawla's individual abilities in falconry, archery, shooting, and swordsmanship. The detail I've highlighted on the lower right, for example, shows the Nawab shooting an arrow through a flame. So Jaunty has actually personalized paintings that might otherwise be understood as generic. And in parallel, the facing text for each of these images quickly mentions Muharram and quickly mentions the hunt, but actually goes on at length about Shuja-ud-Dawla and Jaunty's close connection with him and what an important ally he is for the French. So on one level, the album also operates as a Shuja-nama, a book of Shuja-ud-Dawla. We also then see images really highlighting Jaunty. So on the left, we see the signing of the Treaty of Benares, where he represented Shuja-ud-Dawla to negotiate on his behalf with the English. And after these events, Jaunty is presented to the Mughal Emperor Shah Alam, an event that is recorded on the right. As we have seen elsewhere, the image provides a point of entry for the facing text while also reinforcing and including an abundance of visual information. It also suggests that if the album was an ethnography and a translation of the Aini Akbari and a Shuja-nama, it was perhaps also a Gentil Nama, a book of Jaunty, really highlighting his embeddedness in the central role he was playing in contemporary Indian politics. In fact, throughout the album and in related works from the Jaunty collection, we see him aspiring to the model of the ideal vizier embodied by his Mughal predecessor from 2 centuries prior, Abu Fazl. In effect, he sets himself up as the Abu Fazl of his time, a claim that was given material substantiation through projects like the Jaunty album. In exchange for his service, Shuja-ud-Dawla bestowed Jaunty with an honorific title in Persian, Rafi'ud-Dawla Nizam-e-Jang Bahadur Tadbir al-Muluk, uplifter of the state, leader in war, the valiant, and the council of kings. This was fashioned into a seal, which we see at the top here, another material expression that we see on many of the works in the Jaunty collection. The album would ultimately allow Jaunty to play this role not only in the Mughal context, but also in France. It authorized his expertise by presenting, in its other sections, the knowledge that he acquired in India. In the end, Jaunty emerges as the ultimate mediator. His political mediations on the ground are paralleled by his epistemological mediations on the page. Album and patron alike are poised to speak with authority across cultural spheres. And again, it was by marshaling the Mughal manuscript tradition and the material possibilities of the Kitabkhana that Jaunty was able to make the claims that he did. In this manner, the Jaunty album corroborates his correspondence and other writings in which he emphasizes his embeddedness in Awadh and his broader knowledge of Indian and Islamic society. In official correspondence, Jaunty asserts his ability to provide reliable and thorough intelligence, repeatedly using the word témoignage, which invokes observation, testimony, and evidence. His memoirs also highlight his privileged position at court, as they are dedicated to Shuja Abdullah and contains plenty of boasting about his role as special advisor to the Nawab. Jaunty also claimed a personal connection to the Mughal cultural sphere through his Indo-Portuguese wife, Teresa Velho, whose ancestor Juliana had close ties to the Mughal court and whose story Jaunty includes in his writings. So given the album's visual multilingualism and its slippage between genres and its work in building the credibility of Jaunty, it was poised to operate on multiple levels once it reached France. For the final sections of this talk, I'd like to touch upon the French reception and audiences of the Jaunty collection. One major audience for the album was a scholarly group, the early French Orientalists. The larger Jaunty collection ultimately became part of the Royal Library in France, and the library's present-day incarnation, the Bibliothèque Nationale in Paris, holds over 180 Jaunty objects divided among multiple departments. These included both the newly created late 18th century works, like the album we've been thinking about today, as well as manuscripts dating from earlier periods. Included in this group of older extant manuscripts was indeed a copy of the Ain-i Akbari in the original Persian. This meant that Orientalist scholars could read the original Persian text, take in the Jaunty album, and understand the connections between the two. Louis-Mathieu Langlais, the first keeper of Oriental manuscripts at the Royal Library, spoke of the value of the objects in the Jaunty collection, commending the expertise with which they had been selected. Jaunty was also closely associated with Abraham Anquetil du Perron, who was known for his translations of sacred texts, including the Sanskrit Upanishads and the Zend-Avesta. Notably, Anquetil du Perron did not directly translate the Upanishads from Sanskrit, but actually used a Persian translation that had been done for the Mughal Prince Dara Shikoh in the 17th century. Catalogs show that Jaunty had acquired a copy of this manuscript for Anquetil du Perron. Thus, an ancient Sanskritic text was translated by a Mughal prince into Persian, subsequently purchased by an Indo-French soldier turned scholar, and ultimately translated into Latin by a French Orientalist. The circuitousness and richness of that journey serves as the perfect complement to the complexities and layers we see in the Jaunty album. This was also a period when illustrated narratives were published and circulated among a print-enthused public. Earlier in this century, the French engraver Bernard Picard, together with the publisher Jean-Frédéric Bernard, had produced a bestseller in their religious ceremonies and customs of all the peoples of the world. Originally published in 10 volumes, beginning in the 1720s, the text had been notably successful. Like the Jaunty album, it included purportedly documentary images, and also like the Jaunty album, it was based on the study and translation of original source texts. Producing a work like Picard may have been one possibility that Jaunty had in mind when he amassed his collection and had objects like his album produced. Indeed, the compartmentalized composition that we see in many of the folios would lend itself to the production of plates. And this comparison certainly suggests a close dialogue with Picard. There was also potential beyond print. In 1788, Louis XVI received an embassy from Tipu Sultan of Mysore. When preparations were underway for a Sèvres porcelain set to commemorate the event, the creators were encouraged to consult Monsieur Jaunty and his collection of Indian drawings for design ideas. While the set doesn't actually appear to replicate any of the Jaunty images, so we can't actually compare them, the archival correspondence around the commission attests to this exchange and the reputation enjoyed by the Jaunty collection. For French designers and artists, the maraca quality of the album was, I think, quite significant. Just as the maraca in the Mughal world functioned as a repository of visual ideas for artists to draw upon, so too could the Jaunty album serve a similar purpose in France. In addition to the attraction it might hold for scholarly, artistic, and popular circles, the album and collection were positioned to appeal to a royal audience. As we have seen in his writings, Jaunty repeatedly praises Abu Fazl for his services as a historian and minister to Akbar, exemplified by the composition of the Aini Akbari, this kind of predecessor text for the Jaunty album. In bringing a similar object to France, Jaunty invokes the service of the historian and advisor. He is recorded as receiving 2 audiences with Louis, and again, the album was just one of several works that he composed and submitted to the Royal Library. And indeed, during the Mysore embassy, Jaunty was summoned to act as a translator and mediator. In this painting, we see one of the many appearances made by the embassy, with the Mysore representatives at the center shepherded by individuals like Jaunty. Thus, the album began its life intimately connected to the Aini Akbari, but within a decade of its creation, it was instrumentalized in a variety of ways, becoming open to new associations and meanings. Its level of specificity retained or rejected to varying degrees. The implications of this project are manifold. For while the contents of the Jaunty album functioned as evidence of its patron's expertise, the fullness of this claim stemmed from the fact that the Jaunty album took a material form that was consonant with its environment of generation. Jaunty performed the work of an Indo-Persian historian and elite patron, extending existing histories to include contemporary events, many of which he claimed to shape or participate in himself. These narratives were enhanced and animated through the incorporation of images, a complex process that was largely dependent on the artists who produced the paintings and the collaborative setting of the Kitabkhana. Until now, the afterlife of the object in Europe has masked the Mughal aesthetic and intellectual systems that were essential to its formation. The Jaunty album was as much the product of Mughal manuscript culture in its visual, textual, and material dimensions as it was an object that spoke to French engagement with India. The images in the album operate on multiple levels, mediating between established visual modes and new ones fashioned by artists working in a Mughal idiom. The album also draws upon and adapts a foundational Persian Mughal text, the Aini Akbari, using it as a point of departure. Within the album, 2 types of folios work in tandem, those depicting Jaunty on the ground and those that visualized the knowledge that he had acquired and subsequently instrumentalized and mobilized for his personal advancement. Methodologically, framing the Jaunty album in the way that I have is crucial. It demonstrates the agency of Indian makers and the potency of the artistic and epistemic systems that were current in 18th century India. In this case, the production of what would come to be understood as, quote, French knowledge was indebted not only to Enlightenment period approaches and practices, but equally to Mughal modes of knowing and representing. Thank you.
Thank you, Chanchal, so much. It's a testament to the richness of this talk that every time I formulated a question, the next twist in the reception and the interface of traditions, it prompted me to adjust that question. So I'd like to invite the Zoom audience. We have a pretty brief amount of time for questions submitted from the audience, maybe 10 minutes. So please go ahead and put them in the chat, or if you feel confident showing your face, you could also raise your hand and pose the question yourself. And while we collect a few, I'll just quickly ask, Chanchal, I'm wondering about the role of maybe a concept like memory in the Jaunty album, partly because of the key to the text that's present and yet not visible in the images, and partly because of Morocco culture, which is such a helpful concept to try to grapple with this, and what we've been taught about how albums can also be about reviving muscle memory in writing or in a perfected form. And I'm wondering if maybe that's a category that feels the pressure of the 18th century here, or how you're thinking about that.
That's a great way of asking that question. I mean, and you bring in memory. for me, in thinking about the album and its production and the collection in general, that's also, if I think about the moments of its production in North India, I think also of orality and how those two go hand in hand. And so we'll see that kind of, I think, manifest in a few different ways. So here, I think we go back to the kind of agency of the makers who collaborated with Jaunty and kind of what they are drawing on. Then you also have Jaunty's actual memories, right, which are manifest in his memoirs, which he writes, but which are actually published posthumously after his death in the early 1800s and 18 teens. So you have actually these multiple, like the album, the memories and their transmission are also kind of layered. So I think that's something to certainly grapple with, so that you have the memory of the artists who actually produced these images that we're consuming. You have the memory of Jaunty's experience across his time in India, because he is there for 25 years. And there's certainly a conversation taking place between Jaunty and artists. And that's also kind of informing some of the subject matter. And then you have the album and the other objects from the collection that become a sort of way of aiding Jaunty's memories when he returns to France, and he will then produce new works kind of drawing upon them. And so again, like the album is this kind of material truth that he can point to, right? So that it's not just his individual subjectivity that is kind of coming to the fore when he tells these stories, but he's pointing to the substantiation that's offered by the album. So in a way, we have memory kind of informing the production of the album, and then the album doing a certain work to then substantiate and kind of make memory less fluffy in a way back in France.
Thank you. I'm going to turn to what people have submitted, and I'm going to group them. So we had an early question from Theo W. before you presented the Aini Akbar, but wondering about whether the body of work that you're studying touches on any images or texts connected to Akbar's Dini Ilahi or his Kitabkhana.
That's such a great question. And the way I'll answer it is to let you know and let the audience know that the other text that really drew Jaunty was actually the Tarikh-i Farishta. So in a way, he doesn't really have this, which I'll talk about in a minute. He doesn't really have this concern with Akbar necessarily, but with this idea of history. And these are texts that were becoming or were or would become canonical. And so you have this history of the kings of India that he produces an abridged illustrated translation of that. So the attraction seems to be more for kind of sweeping histories, not really universal histories, but these kind of sweeping histories that can take this broad look at India. It is, I think, really this imperial mindset, colonial mindset, and see how he can fit himself as an agent of the French into it. What ends up happening, of course, I mean, he's this classic kind of third space character, right? Because it's not, he occupies multiple spaces simultaneously, but the attraction seems to be to a certain kind of history writing rather than to a particular figure. So there is not that interest. And I think that's interesting.
I'm going to quickly group two, and then we have one from Abhishek who will take the end of the thread. So some maybe factual questions. Are there copies of this album that you're describing? And then do you know of other Marakas whose organization correspond to a particular text? How frequent is this practice?
So both great questions. Thanks for both of those. So there are not copies of this album per se in the form that it exists with those exact 58 paintings replicated in the same order or even a similar order. But what there is this house style that I mentioned that gets produced. So you'll see the same images appearing in other texts. So there's a set of illustrated histories. There are about 8 of them that are heavily illustrated, and it's this universe that is the Jaunty collection universe, and they're almost like these stock images that you can see appearing again and again. So not copies of this album per se, but certainly the individual images within the album are copied and populate the collection at large. And then, so I really like this question about the Maraca, whose organization correspond to a particular text. So the thing about the Ain Akbari is it is such an unusual text. There's really kind of nothing like it. So, the long and short of it is no, but in a way, I don't really know of other texts that are like that as well. I mean, you do have various compendia, and you have wonders, and you have other attempts at encyclopedism. But I think that part of why this text works so well to kind of inform the Gentil album, and part of why the album takes the form it does is because of this very specific relationship. Because in fact, with other maracas from particularly the 17th century, but even later, no, there actually is no connection. There's not a lot of maracas with this connection to a specific text. The maraca is really a universe unto its own. It kind of is born of these visual relationships between the contents of the album, and not really between the contents of the album and another outside text.
Great, thank you. So as promised, final question from the audience. This comes from Abhishek, and I'll jump right to the question. I was wondering if you might, so jumping over the praise, right to the question, I was wondering if you might expand a little on the question of the agency of the Indian artists or producers of knowledge in terms of the relations of power which governed Awadh in the late 18th century. There is a school of thought that now sees colonial knowledge as essentially co-produced between colonial subjects and masters. How do you see the production of this manuscript in that light?
Yeah, so it's interesting. I've been working on the Jaunty collection kind of on the side for a number of years, and now it's the subject of my current book. And a couple of things have happened during that time. So one, when we think about the transcultural, there was this period of global mobility, and then there's this period of regional mobility. And so I feel like the way that I've thought about this project is almost an index of kind of whatever trend there is in mobility. And so thinking about regional and local mobilities is one thing that has actually informed the way in which I think about artistic agency in the Kitabkhana. But then also, to get more directly to Abhishek's question, I mean, you hit the nail on the head. I mean, I think that, one idea I've been kind of toying around with is that, the Kitabkhana actually, it makes Orientalism possible. And then the question is, how do you tease that apart, right? So I think, what I see potential in this project is to be, to contribute to a kind of, post-colonial, post-Saidian Orientalist critique, and to kind of rethink that question in terms of what it means for the 18th century in this particular time and place in North India, in Faizabad, and with the particular players who produced this collection, and then to trace its collection, its mobility very specifically to France and the early Orientalist circles that are then exposed to this collection. So yes, absolutely, this project joins those who see colonial knowledge as co-produced between subjects and masters, but also like the good work in this vein actually seeks to completely step outside of that logic altogether as well.
Terrific. Thank you again, Chanchal, for joining us. We're going to now receive you in physical space. We'll put on our masks. Anybody listening who's anywhere near campus, feel free to join us in Stevens Hall. Otherwise, I thank the listeners and community for being with us for this past hour. And thank you again.
Thank you again for your questions, and I really appreciate it.
Bye, guys.